Welcome this morning to Las Vegas, and I want to thank each one of you personally for getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning in Las Vegas to listen to someone talk about insurance. So we've got about an hour and 30-minute program that we're going to have to do in about 45 minutes. So I'll be moving fairly quickly, but hopefully we'll have some time toward the end that allows you to ask questions. If not, we'll step out somewhere one-on-one and I'll be happy to go over any specific question you might have regarding the program this morning or even any other insurance question you might have. So as you see on the board, we're going to be talking about ways to avoid liability. And one of the things I always like to do in any type of insurance talk is revisit for me, but it might be new to you, the 4 elements of risk management. Basically, risk avoidance is just common sense, and that's basically to look, identify hazards and correct those hazards before something happens. And so it's just basically, again, identifying and taking corrective action. As far as risk reduction, one of the examples here I like to show in terms of the element of risk reduction is where you actually utilize a third party from a contractual standpoint to take care of potential exposures that occur on your premises, such as in the winter states where you've got a lot of snow, a snow removal company, and basically you're passing on your risk to that company because they're responsible for making sure the grounds are clean for slip and falls and roofs or the snow's removed from the roofs so you don't have collapse of your roofs. Next is risk transfer, and that's probably one of the elements that we're all probably more knowing. We know that probably more than any of the elements because that's basically buying insurance and you're transferring your liability risk to that insurance carrier. Risk retention, again, very common element in terms of you're taking on some of the risk, and the best example is, and the one we use here is a wind and hail deductible, but you also do the same thing with your personal auto and your home insurance where you've got a deductible, which basically you're retaining some of the risk. One of the, if you don't walk away with anything but this particular point, and that is risk management. And there's a lot of things that fall under that category, but risk management from the standpoint of loss control, insurance programs, safety, should be as important to your company as sales. And I know that's a difficult, possibly difficult concept to look at, but in essence, it's really, you could do so well from a sales standpoint, have a great bottom line, and unfortunately, as a result of a liability claim, that bottom line is taken. And so it's very important that we, as a company, are committed to our risk management because it definitely can have an impact on our longevity within our industry. The next item is basically there's probably many more sources, but these are the key sources as it pertains to liability exposure on your self-storage properties. Employees, tenants, guests, contractors, and subcontractors. And we've identified these because these sources are where our claims are coming from on a regular basis at our company. Let's talk about employees. In terms of some of the liability exposure, and I'm going to kind of go through these fairly quickly because there's some repetition here in terms of what might occur from a liability standpoint. But employees do create some liability exposure from a potential criminal activity of that employee that could create a liability exposure for the company. Obviously, there's bodily injury, slip and falls associated with employees, and an employee can be involved in an improper lien sale. not following the statutory, the guidelines, causing liability exposure to the self-storage operation. We see commonly we don't do workers' comp, but our independent agents write workers' comp, and we've done workers' comp in the past, but one of the biggest challenges associated with that is when employees try to do repairs and maintenance, which is common. Unfortunately, sometimes they use the wrong equipment or they don't have the skill set to do that work, and they're injured as a result of that. Care, custody, and control of tenant goods. I know we have leases that say we're not responsible for the goods, but in many cases what we have is the operation is taking on a parcel from a FedEx or UPS, and you're taking control of that parcel. As a result, you've taken on some liability exposure associated with that. One of the bigger things that we're seeing today is our social media reputational damage exposure. As everyone knows, I mean, every one of our phones today has a camera on it, and unfortunately, if someone sees something on your property, they can take a shot of it and post it, and you can have a reputational damage issue that you're having to deal with. And then we've got federal, state regulatory violations, and that's sometimes very challenging, and it's important that you seek out counsel to understand what you're responsible for as far as OSHA, ADA, any type of regulatory requirements within your state. It's important that you understand what they are, and I would say in most cases those regulatory violations are not covered under your insurance program, and if you do pay a fine, it's coming out of your general fund. Discrimination, wrongful termination. Also, I could include in that sexual harassment, but again, employees could cause liability exposure as a result of those type of things. Tenants, liability exposure as it refers to tenants. Again, the tenants, we go back to the improper lien sale. They, as a result of us doing an improper lien sale, turn around and sue us. We've got a liability exposure. Obviously, slip and fall again. Slip and falls are common in the industry, and unfortunately, that creates a liability exposure for the operation. Again, criminal activity. Any type of criminal activity on the premise creates liability exposure for you as an operator. The others, damage from wind, fire, water, collapse. Those are, and some might consider that, well, that's a little bit of a stretch from the standpoint of why would I be negligent. I take, for example, the fire situation, and we've had situations where we were burning grass around the self-storage facility, caught the facility on fire. We've had situations where we had individuals welding at the facility, catching the facility on fire. In those particular instances, you're going to be held negligent, and the damage associated with the contents probably is going to be paid through your insurance if you've got the proper insurance. Damage to tenant-owned vehicles, we see that also. Again, that kind of goes back to repair and maintenance, making sure your signage is properly installed, your fences are up and maintained so that we don't have, and your gates. We have not a rash, but we commonly have gates that come down on the cars and unfortunately cause damage, which end up causing a liability claim as a result of that. And again, it's important from infestation, vermin, mold, that we're maintaining our facilities to mitigate that type of exposure, because if we don't have that contract in place for an exterminator, or we're not maintaining our roofs where we've got water coming into the unit, those create liability exposures for you as an operator. Own rental trucks, again, that's an area. Some have the liability is transferred to a third party, such as U-Haul or Ryder, Budget. Those are those type of companies that you're not responsible in most cases, depending on the contractual language. But it is, if you own your own rental trucks, you're going to be held. You could be held accountable for a variety of things as a result of leasing that or giving that truck to the tenant. Again, federal, state, regulatory. That's we've got and hear and read about a variety of different things in various states. Some states more than others, but we've got federal, state regulatory violations that, as a result, the tenant brings that violation to the attention of authorities, and again, you have to deal with that element. Social media reputational damage. Again, the tenant is on your site. They have the ability to take photos, communicate that out very quickly throughout the community. So it's very important that we maintain our facility premises. Liability exposure resulting from lease violations. We have, these are just a few, but exceeding total value limitations. We highly recommend that you have value limitations within your lease. And I say in most cases that's in what we see is $5,000. And it requires that the tenant request permission to place more value in the unit. Storage of hazardous materials. Use of flammable materials and open flames. This we'll talk about a little bit more, but that's very concerning, as we have seen probably more fires in the last 10 years than I've seen in the last 20 years. And probably even in the last 5 years we've seen more fires. And as in many of these fires, a result of individuals within the, working in the units, using candles, having stoves and gas, and you mixed all these things, and unfortunately you create a problem. On-site vehicle repairs. I know that personally I've seen that in my own storage facility. I don't own a facility, but where I store my goods. But I've seen people working on vehicles, the motors pulled out, tools and equipment all over the place. You're creating a lot. When you're allowing that, you're creating a liability exposure for you as an operator. Tenant residing in a unit. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Social media reputational damage, as we've touched on through the various sources, and uninsured contents. Again, we highly recommend that as an individual operator, you have evidence of insurance requirement, and I know some of you do, some of you don't, but again, the value of that is that you're trying to make sure that the individual does have insurance to mitigate them coming to you as a result of damage to their goods in the event of a loss. This is just an example of what we've picked up on YouTube.
So if you're going to live in a storage unit, you're going to need to be as invisible as you possibly can be. You basically need to be a ghost. If anybody finds out you're here, that's when you start running into trouble. So first of all, I needed power for my unit. So what I did is I ran an extension cord along the power cable up here, and I sort of zip tied it up. So you can't really tell its power is going to my unit unless you are looking closely. So this is my unit here, and at the top of the unit you can see I have an antenna, and that's so I can get a cell signal inside the unit itself, because once you close the door it drops all signal. I have a lock which I've magnetized onto the door so it looks like it's locked even when it's not. And then when I actually do want to lock it, I can just use this lock or use another one down here and leave that one there. Alright, so let's take a look at the unit now. So in here I've got my TV, entertainment center set up there, I've got my bed, I've got my kitchen area over there, complete with a fridge, and my couch over here. Once you're inside here, you can close the door, and I've screwed on a latch here so that way you can close it and sort of lock it from the inside. I've also put a mirror up so you can see what you're doing. Up here I've got a toaster oven, and this toaster oven actually works pretty well. I'd say it works just as well as a conventional oven.
We can't make this up. This is a true issue, and as you can see, as you see on the screen right there, the toaster oven. Obviously, we've got significant amount of exposure to our facility as a result of this occurring. Again, we'll go back. We'll talk a little more in the talk in terms of the importance of inspections and observing and awareness, seeing things like the extension cord and the lock. Those probably should have been recognized through a premise inspection. And obviously, these are the type of things we want to avoid in our facilities, because that individual, if we know or have any idea of people that are doing something of this nature, that creates negligence on our part and potentially could cost us significant dollars as a result of a fire occurring or some other type of damage occurring, or the individual possibly getting locked in their facility, locked in their unit. We'd lock them in the unit and then we get sued because they're living in our unit. So it's one of those things you don't win. Liability exposure to guests. Again, we've got guests that are coming on our facilities for auctions, special events, and as a result, you're increasing your liability exposure by just the fact that you've got a frequency of individuals that are coming on site. Like I said, a lot of this is repetitive, but from the standpoint of the sources, bodily, we've got the criminal activity that in terms of guests that might be on our site. In terms of the next, we've got also the guests coming in that are moving in and out, helping our tenants move in and out. They don't know the rules, the regulations. They're not familiar with the premise, and again, as a result of them on our site, we've got potential liability exposure. And we repeat the federal, state regulatory. They still apply for those guests that are coming on site, so it's important that as you, as an operator, you're familiar with OSHA, ADA requirements. Make sure that you're meeting those requirements on your facilities. Contractors and subcontractors, that's our next source. In terms of sources of liability exposure related to contractors and subcontractors, lack of adequate insurance limits and coverages. It's critical, number one, it's critical that you ask that the individual provide evidence of insurance if they're going to be doing any work on your facilities. It's also critical that they have proper coverage. At a minimum, we suggest that they have the same limits of liability as you do in terms of your insurance policy. We've got the potential exposure of defective work that they might be doing. Ultimately, we've seen a variety of different type of claims, not only liability but property claims because of defective work. We've seen buildings collapse because of snow. We've seen just the doors that have fallen, and this is not very common. I'm just saying these are the type of things you have to be careful about. Our industry does a very good job, but in some cases that defective work creates exposure to you. Equipment exposure, any type of equipment that they're bringing on site, be sure it's roped off or signage is there. You just have to be careful because you've got children and individuals that are coming on site, and that equipment could become possibly a potential liability exposure for you. Bodily injury, slip and fall, the work that they're doing, all the things we kind of touched about, slips and falls, falling objects, collapse. Now this is them doing something and causing somebody else to be injured and hurt as a result of their activities. Contracts, again, we highly recommend that in terms of contracts, that you utilize legal counsel. Try not to cut and paste other contracts to put together contracts for yourself, because there's a variety of different elements within those contracts that you want to make sure what you're responsible for, who's responsible for what, the limits, the liability, the insurance requirements. Contracts are extremely important, and we're always trying to emphasize to go to your independent agent or your attorney and let them review any type of contract that you might sign with a contractor or a subcontractor coming on your site. Additional sources, we're seeing more and more mixed use as a result of zoning. A lot of cities are requiring that you're building retail in front of the facility, and as a result you've got additional type of exposures. Common areas, you've got people coming onto these retail areas and visiting the retail areas, and as a result you have got potential slip and falls. You could be named in that, even though, and that's why the contract between you and those that are leasing from you are important, to make sure that everyone knows who's responsible for what. Today we're seeing more and more office space, non-storage warehouse, non-cooking restaurants, all are being built in and around the facilities. Owned and adjacent property and vacant land, just remember that still there's an exposure there. Make sure your independent agent is aware of that land to broaden your liability coverage to cover that particular area, because anything that might occur on that land is a potential exposure to you as an operator. Additional sources, operations owned other than self-storage, and this is another area that is not new, but you're an entrepreneurial group. You're trying different things from a revenue standpoint. You're building car washes. You're adding mailboxes and shipping to your facilities. You're becoming a general contractor. Some cases just for yourself, but in some cases you're building for other people. All of these things, make sure that you're working with your independent agent and they know every step of the way what you're doing, because there could be different types of coverages that you're required for those specific types of work that you're doing. Again, the inadequate insurance coverage and limits is probably one of the largest exposures that you have. So it's make sure to work with individual agents that have an expertise in your area. Make sure you've got the proper limits and coverages for your operation. Real quickly, just this is not part of this is the insurance part, and it's not how to avoid liability, but we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that the various types of coverages that you need from a liability standpoint. You've got comprehensive business liability, but really it's covering your premises, one of the key exposures, slip and falls, things of that nature. The employment practices liability we touched on a little bit earlier, but that type of employment practices liability is going to cover discrimination, sexual harassment, wrongful termination. They're not often, we don't see that very often within our industry, but when we do see it, it could be substantial dollars. And if you don't have that coverage in the event you're sued as a result of that, obviously it's going to come out of your general fund. Customer goods legal liability, this is one of the areas that we actually were involved in pioneering this particular coverage, but it's been around for quite some time, and it's critical to your operation. Even though we have all of our leases indicating that the individual is not responsible, or they're responsible for their goods, they need to have insurance. Customer goods legal liability is helping you in the event there's negligence on your part. You can purchase limits today in the industry up to $1 million. My recommendation is purchase as much as you can afford, because you never know. It's probably our biggest concern as a result of, in terms of that particular exposure, is more of a catastrophic type loss where we've got a fire and we've got several units damaged or buildings damaged, and we were at fault, and this is where this comes into play. Sale and disposal liability, again, everyone hears about lien sales. We talk about it. It's one of the most interesting topics of our industry. and we see a lot of claims coming through as a result of that. Most cases, it is purely it's purely not following the state statutes. So it's very important, and we'll talk about the training, the importance of training to your employees in terms of following the state statutes, the steps. But there's again, the sale and disposal, similar to the customer goods legal liability, you can purchase up to $1 million of limit for that particular coverage. Employee resident managers, personal liability. Now, not everyone has employees living on site, but if you do, this is a nice added benefit for that employee because it gives them some extra coverage outside of the business itself. And again, I look at it as truly a benefit that you can purchase, and it's not a very costly item to add to your coverage. Data compromise coverage. We talk about cyber. You hear a lot about cyber liability and the concerns that we have about cyber liability. This particular coverage is really the basic preventative coverage to avoid cyber liability. And that is basically where we talk about in the event there is a breach, restoration of the information that you have, credit monitoring, and the other is, I feel like Rick Perry right now, legal assistance support that you might need in terms of the possible breach. The good thing, what I see in the industry in terms of this particular exposure is that we're transferring the risk in most cases to our facility software management companies. If we have a facility software management company, the merchant accounts, all those are third party. They're collecting the data, they're retaining the data, so you as an individual are not responsible for the breach of that data. It's if you're keeping other type of private, personal information, confidential information on site, that's when you're exposed if somehow that information is breached, through electronically or just physically taken out of your site. So it's very important you take care of that and recognize the importance of that information because it's a high profile area today. In terms of, I always like to talk about umbrella coverage. We highly recommend umbrella coverage to a business. We recommend that at minimum you carry $1 million umbrella on your insurance policies. Basically, the umbrella, and you'll see a visual, the next visual, is a layer over your primary coverages. As we talked about, the CGL is your comprehensive general liability, the customer goods legal liability, your sale and disposal liability, auto liability, employer's liability that's associated with your workers' comp. If you have $1 million limit, that umbrella is layering on top of that. And we've seen that probably a handful, in my 17 years in the self-storage industry, I've seen it a handful of times getting into the umbrella section, but you don't want to be the one, and I can't tell you which one of you are going to be the ones that it breaches into that particular area. But we've seen a few times where the umbrella has kicked in and in multi-million-dollar type of claims that occur. This is what I would say is our meat and potatoes of our presentation, and it's basically 6 ways to avoid liability exposure. We're going to be talking about inspections, the importance of inspections, maintenance, the rental lease, written policies and procedures, the training associated with that, managing the data, which we just touched on just now, and the comprehensive insurance program. This is just a kind of an example of, I think everyone would agree as you walk upon the green and you see this, if you're a golfer, you'd probably say that that is an exposure associated with your game. And in most cases, unless that's the only ball you've got left, you're going to walk around that particular hole and go on to the next tee box. And I think one of the purposes of showing this is that We do have occasionally, we have alligators on our facilities, not literally, but maybe you do in some states. But it's important that that we are constantly going out, reviewing our premise and inspecting our premises to identify these alligators that might exist. Because a lot of things happen. Number one, they could potentially create a loss associated with the damage to the individual or property of the individual. Or the other is that it's from a reputational damage. Someone comes on site, a variety of things, and I could just give you numerous examples, but high weeds, fences with holes in it, paint's not, the facility's not painted up to date. Those type of things, the individual looks at that, and like this particular case, they move on down the road to the next facility. So there's a lot of other reasons other than liability exposure to go through the process of identifying exposures on your facility and taking corrective action. Inspections, we are more and more today where we recommend that. I write on it constantly in terms of the value of inspections. We're looking at a variety of different type of technology to assist the operator with inspections because it's critical that as a result, and first of all, what we're looking at the walkways, the pavements, the steps, the locks, the lighting, the cameras, the security equipment, gates, fences, landscaping. These are all things that we're looking at as we walk through the facility. But the importance of this is identifying potential exposures and taking corrective action. We feel like probably what we're seeing today in some of the fires that they're just not being identified. The individuals that are within the units are doing work, and we're not taking corrective measures to stop that activity. Roof inspections, again, goes back to there could be wind, a potential wind exposure where we've got holes in our roof, the metal's been lifted up. Could be a variety of different reasons you might have holes in your roof, but that obviously we want to identify that and correct it as quickly as possible because again, the potential water getting into the unit could cause damage and we could be held liable as a result of that. Again, fire extinguishers, sprinkler system, all those things to be maintained. We've just experienced a significant fire recently, and it did have a sprinkler system, but it appears to be a significant loss, and we're doing investigating now just to understand why the sprinkler system didn't take care of the fire, extinguish the fire. In terms of what we're doing, in terms of why do we do this? I've touched on a lot of that. We're mitigating potential criminal activity, thefts, assaults, trespassing. If a criminal element is in your facility and they see you walking the premises constantly, taking notes, and even addressing them from the standpoint of speaking to individuals as you walk the premises, which I would say most of you are doing. That type of activity is probably going to push the criminal element on down to another, and that would be our objective, to push them on down to somewhere else and get them outside of our facility. Lease violations, that's the purpose of our inspections from the standpoint of identifying not only potential exposures but lease violations. Individuals, if you see someone in the units and they've got a candle going, you need to go in and advise them to exterminate that candle. Now, if there's situations where you don't feel comfortable going into that type of situation, the worst case scenario, if you have to call authorities or if you have to call the owner, if you're a manager and don't feel comfortable, but the critical thing is to have them terminate what they're doing and to make sure they understand that if they continue it, they're going to be asked to leave. And that we talked about, we saw tenants living and residing in the units, and of course we all probably have experienced individuals working on vehicles. We've had some of our worst claims is allowing individuals working on vehicles all the way to deaths on our sites that we insure. So even though we like to be, we might view it as good customer service to allow them to do things of that nature, but those type of things could come back and bite you in terms of an exposure and problem for the operator. And then again, we're avoiding customer goods legal liability claims by having that, doing that inspection. Maintenance areas that we want to focus on, again, snow and ice removal in those states. We're in the winter states. Landscaping, weed control, all of these things are important from a variety of reasons, just good customer service, but it also limits a lot of various exposures from vermin to just any type of not being able to see from a criminal element, not being able to see particular areas because people can or could hide in the grass or things of that nature. I'm being exaggerating a little bit, but just trying to make a point. Again, the pest control, making sure that we're taking care of it from a maintenance standpoint, and climate control equipment, making sure we're maintaining it properly and not creating a potential liability exposure as a result of our lack of maintenance. Again, as a result of our maintenance, we're mitigating. Hopefully we're going to reduce our slip and falls. We're going to reduce any potential customer goods legal liability from fires, vermin, mold. Just basically general safety is going to be in place. And again, the maintenance is going to help us from a reputational damage standpoint. Again, like we talked about, everyone has a camera today on their phone, and people are quick to anything that they see. Everyone wants to push out something, a picture of something, seems like today. So it only creates reputational type situations that you want to avoid. Rental lease, the focus areas. These are areas that we recommend that are in your rental lease that we look at from an underwriting standpoint when we get submissions coming into our company. We look to see if someone offers tenant insurance. Again, this is not only our position is that if individuals have tenant insurance or insurance on their contents, then they're less likely to sue you in the event of a damage to their contents. Limitation of value, which we talked about. Lien sale default and remedies, that's clauses that need to be written within your lease. Hold harmless, who's responsible for what, and not in basically you're trying to. We're all as businesses. It's just our objective, not from a bad customer service standpoint, but if we can push, responsibility to the other party. It just reduces our exposure. So that's the hold harmless is an important clause that within your lease. And storage of hazardous materials. Although the fact that it's in the lease is not going to keep people from storing it, but we want to again do our best in terms of awareness and make sure they understand the value of not storing hazardous material within our facility. The rental lease, again, the liability that we're mitigating, the sale and disposal liability potential claims, the customer goods legal liability, and other type of lawsuits. So that's what's a well-written rental lease. Highly recommend. Again, one of our biggest challenges from claims that we see in the operation are the fact that individuals have cut and paste leases and not utilize their association lease or their legal counsel to create their lease. Written policies and procedures plus training, that's, I know you've heard it over and over, and we just like the repetition of making sure everyone is aware that although we have all these policies, and number one, we need policies and procedures. Number two, we need to make sure that our employees are trained. A lot of lien sales that we see is just a result of an untrained employee doing something that they were not aware of, they shouldn't be doing. So that's again, a lot of that too happens with that new employee. So you need you need, even as small, no matter how large or small you are, you need to have that orientation program to make sure to go over some of these particular items when that new employee comes on board, and then re-emphasize them every 6 months to a year with your existing employee workforce. Social media, social media, there needs to be rules and regulations in terms of who's posting what for your company. We highly recommend that if there's, again, if 1 or 2 employees, it doesn't matter the size, you have a designated employee that would be posting about social media, and that other employees not be posting about your company on social media. Human resources, offering insurance, training, all these things. A lot of people are uncomfortable with offering insurance. A lot of managers are, from the standpoint of our new, we've got the new limited license, or I say new, it's been around for a while now. But we make sure that you've got the proper training for those employees that are talking about insurance to their tenants, how to handle bodily injury claims, regulatory compliance. All these things are important, and again, this is critical. This list, it's not, I think you understand the point that these type of things are critical to help us avoid potential liability exposure to our operation. And what we're doing, and we've touched on these, basically we're limiting, by having the policies and procedures and the training, basically what we're doing, we're limiting our exposure, and that's our objective. And from a risk management standpoint, we want to reduce our exposure, and training and having policies and procedures and training helps us do that. The data, we talked about that a little bit already, but data breaches occur. We read about that. We don't see this very often in our industry. Not that it's not going to happen. Some of you may have experienced it, but again, the critical thing here is to recognize the importance of the confidentiality, the personal information of our tenants, and how we control that information. And because when that information gets out, that's when we create the potential cyber liability exposure to you as an operator. We talked about email well, we hadn't talked about email advertising, but you have to, again, it's critical today that we have to follow the laws as it pertains to any type of email communications, opt-in, opt-out. We could probably spend a whole half session on that today in terms of the laws and regulations. We've seen, as a result of some type of advertising in the past, I have to say we've had some significant claims as a result of this. So make sure you're aware of the laws in terms of who you can email and advertise to. We're mitigating, by managing our data, again, we're mitigating potential lawsuits, as we've touched on, from lawsuits, statutory fines, the reputational damage element, and just pure operational disruption, whether it's this type of claim or any type of claim, any liability claim. They're always disruptive. It takes time out of your time, your employees' time, very unproductive. So by being preventative, taking preventative measures, that in itself is productive for your operation. The comprehensive insurance program, the focus areas are that, again, first of all, find a good agent to work with you. Make sure they are working with you in terms of the coverage and limits that you have. Those are critical. That's on an annual basis, I would say 6 months annual basis. You want to work with your agent to make sure that you understand what coverage you have, what limits you have, what exclusions you have on your policy, what are the catastrophic losses, what type of coverages you have in place in terms of what happens in the event of a catastrophic loss. The contractual agreements, again, we recommend that any of your contractual agreements be reviewed by your self-storage operator, reviewed by your independent agent or your legal counsel to make sure that all the pieces are in place and limit your liability. Lawsuit, again, as a result of doing those things, basically we're just mitigating potential lawsuits, and specifically from the insurance standpoint, by working with your independent agent, we want to avoid uninsured or underinsured losses. Mitigating our photo here is basically we've taken the alligator that we saw earlier, and we have basically taken corrective measures, and we have now controlled the exposure, and that's our objective at our self-storage facilities: identify and take corrective measures and control any potential exposures that might exist. Choosing a broker, and I've touched on this earlier, we like to definitely always communicate the importance of identifying a good broker to work with you in terms of self-storage. It's good to have someone that knows self-storage, a good broker that knows the industry. Insurance designation is always good. It just shows a commitment in terms of their continuing education. We highly recommend you use a A-rated carrier or higher. It's good to know from the standpoint of the carrier how much volume of business they're writing with self-storage. If you're their only self-storage, there's a lot of people write self-storage insurance, but if they only write a small group book of self-storage, that probably is an indication of their understanding in terms of how to handle claims. And then it's always a good idea, we recommend that when a carrier is recommended by an independent agent, to ask the agent to give you some references of other operators that are being insured by that carrier, to talk to them about their claim experience, because at the end of the day, that's why we buy insurance, is the claims, how they're being handled, and keeping us out of trouble and keeping our business intact. That's the presentation today. Again, hopefully you've walked away with a nugget of information that there is some element of recognition that risk management is of equal value to you in terms of your sales of your operation. And thank you for there's great appreciation for you coming out this morning at 8 o'clock in the morning to listen to someone talk about insurance in Las Vegas. Thank you.
Quick question, what's the one clause that you'd like to see in a contractor's addendum for people who are coming on the property where you've got work being done? What's that one clause that you'd like to see in that addendum that you add to the contractor's bid or agreement?
I think the hold harmless is the critical piece, who's responsible for what. Again, they're going to try to push off as much of the liability exposure to you, and you're going to need to push back.
How effective, generally speaking, how effective is a clause that says you're not responsible for this, or you shouldn't be doing that, or whatever?
Yeah, it's in terms of for example, you're not responsible for the damage to the customer goods. It is probably the strongest element of our industry in terms of liability. We decline claims in terms of that particular element if we're not negligent. If we're not negligent, that clause holds up in every court case.
What about when both parties are agreeing to arbitrate a resolution? Does that work?
I don't have that much experience, but I'm an advocate of arbitration versus going through the courts. I would say in a lot of times our operators are out arbitrating and negotiating, maybe not on a formal basis, but to resolve an issue before it reaches that level. The quicker we address an issue from a liability standpoint, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a slip and fall or damage to property, the quicker we expedite resolving and finding a resolution, the less likely we're going to end up with a lawsuit. Well, thank you again very much. I appreciate it.